live in a rural area with my elderly grandfather and am his primary caretaker. We have very few neighbors, no sidewalks, a small town. We have very few break-ins or really any crime in general in this area. A lot of wooded areas and farmland. My house is surrounded by woods and has a tree line separating us from our neighbors. I have extensive firearm training and also have worked as a firearm instructor in the past. So, last Friday, I'm sitting in my basement on my couch about to go to sleep. This is a pretty regular occurrence for me. My couch sits in front of a big window, the blinds always closed, and a glass door that leads outside, covered with a semi-transparent shade. You can see through it, but just barely, enough to make out a silhouette if you need to. Now, it was about almost 11 p.m. and I was watching a movie with headphones on when I thought that I heard a noise outside, which is a bit weird considering that I was wearing headphones with the volume up pretty high. So I took off the headphones to listen more closely. I heard what sounded like footsteps in the gravel driveway just outside of my door, but not walking, more like, I don't know, dancing or maybe sprinting, like they were moving very fast. At the time, I got up and looked out the glass door and I saw nothing, so I chalked it up to just being an animal. I sat back down on the couch and was about to put my headphones back on when I heard 3 distinct taps on my window, just opposite my couch. Naturally, I'm a bit startled by that because no one I know is going to do that. They would call me or just knock on my door, especially this late at night. As I stand up again, I hear the gravel in the driveway rustling again, this time louder and as if somebody is running away. The direction that I heard them running is directly into a briar patch and densely wooded area. So I grab my rifle that I keep in the closet just beside the basement door, and I step outside. Using the flashlight attached to the rifle, I scan the tree line looking for possible threats because I'm convinced at this point that some people are here to rob me. I see nothing and go back inside thinking that maybe still, probably more trying to convince myself that it could have been an animal of some sort. At this point, I turn off all the lights inside and just sort of stand behind the glass door with the shade, with the outside floodlights on. This way I could see outside and nobody could see in, just sort of watching. I was making sure everything was okay before I had to go to bed. It's extremely quiet outside, like in scary movies when they say even the bugs and the birds are silent. That was now occurring. Not a cricket or a locust, not anything was making a sound. As I'm almost ready to give up and say it was just my imagination, I see a flicker of light in the woods in front of me. If I had to guess, it was maybe the size of a dime, like a reflection of my house lights into metal or something, followed by the bushes rustling. So once again I step outside and yell, "Hey," seeing if I could scare who or whatever it was away. And that was when I hear a loud whisper. That's the best way that I can describe it anyway. It was a whisper, but loud enough for me to hear it from about 100 feet away say, "Hey," back to me. I'm freaked out because I now realize that it's another person. So I shoulder my rifle, point the mounted flashlight back into the woods again, and yell back to them, "Wrong house, dude. Get out of my property unless you want to die tonight," or something along those lines. At that moment, to my right, I hear a person whistle softly. It sounded kind of like they were mimicking a bird, 2 soft whistles, coming from the same tree line just further to the right. At that point, I turn and aim my rifle about 20 feet short and to the left of the tree line, not in the exact direction of the noises in case it was just some dumb kids just pulling a prank or something, and fire 5 shots into the ground to scare whoever it was away. I kept the flashlight pointed at the tree line, scanning for any movement. My neighbor's dog started barking, I assume at the gunshots. I never saw any movement, anyone scattering, never heard footsteps running away, nothing at all. So I walked down to the right side where the whistle came from. The woods are not as dense there as there are no briar bushes there, and I continued to look through the woods looking for any sign of people, I guess, but I still never saw anyone. As I'm walking back up to my house, wondering what the heck just happened, My grandfather, 84, meets me at the door asking me what had happened. He is still of sound mind, but just not so much physically. So I explained to him what had happened, loaded his revolver and set it by his bedside, in case someone tried to break in during the night. We sleep on opposite ends of the house and on separate floors, so I thought that this was the safest option. After I get him back to bed, I go to the upstairs kitchen and I get a bottle of water from the fridge. As I close the refrigerator door, I hear footsteps, but this time on the roof of our 2-story home. The lowest point of our roof would require a ladder to access it. I mean, an Olympic high jumper couldn't make that leap. My whole body is covered in chills at this point. The hair on the back of my neck is standing up. Utter fear is the best way to explain it. My grandfather, being almost deaf, of course didn't hear it, and I'm sure he was already back asleep anyway, but I instantly froze, listening. The footsteps were heavy, grown man-sized at least. They were walking slowly from his room to the kitchen area where I'm at. There's a skylight on the roof of the kitchen, so I remain still and look up towards it, praying that nothing would be looking back at me. I waited a few minutes, the footsteps continued, back and forth from one side of the house to the other. I decided to run back downstairs, and quickly I grabbed my rifle and run outside. Not knowing at this point who or what I'm dealing with, just relying on my training to be able to neutralize the threat if I need to. I try to calm myself, focusing on controlling my breath, as I go to the front yard and begin to scan the roof with my weapons-mounted flashlight. Again, I see nothing. I walk around the house, scanning the trees and the roof for any signs of anyone or anything, but I saw nothing. I repeated this twice, yelling out a few times, "I don't know what you are, but you better get the heck out of here." And eventually I just gave up. Returning inside to watch some TV with my rifle in hand all night now, I sat there and really, that was the end of it. No weird or unnatural occurrences since that night. Needless to say, the last few nights have been a bit rough for me with little to no sleep. I'm still unsure exactly what happened, and I mean, I've never had any hallucinations before. I'm not sure even hallucinations could be that real. I told some family and friends what had happened, and they all kind of brushed it off. They said that I could have imagined the footsteps, or the whistle could have been a bird. It was kids playing a prank, stuff like that. But I just am not so sure about that. All of this has left me wondering a few things. Am I crazy? Did I actually hallucinate all of it? If I did, why did the hallucinations only last for like one night? Could it have been an extremely well-executed prank? Well, I guess. Although I'm really not sure who would have done that and not have jumped out with cameras after or something, announcing that it was a prank. The whistle could have been a bird noise, sure. I'm not a bird expert by any means. But the loud whispering of hay or the distinct loud footsteps on the roof afterward, I really don't think birds can speak or are like 200 plus pounds. Anyways, that's my story. It's the first possible cryptid encounter that I've ever had, or paranormal or whatever. I've experienced some weird, unexplainable things in my past, but I'm definitely a skeptic at best as far as paranormal things go. But that encounter, it definitely freaked me out and has me questioning things, even now. Let me start with a bit of a backstory. So about 9 months ago, I began working as a hospital security guard at a major hospital in my city. It's been the most exciting and enjoyable job that I've ever had. I'm incredibly grateful for it, as I've made many new friends and accumulated countless stories to share. The saying that if you love your job that you never work a day in your life really rings true for me here. I've had such a variety of experiences too, from arresting trespassers to dealing with mental health patients and searching for missing individuals, the list goes on. But those stories are for another day, because today I want to talk about something different, my experience with the paranormal. Before I started this job, I was already intrigued by the idea of paranormal activity in a major hospital. I mean, people pass away in hospitals every day, so you'd think that it would be a hotspot for ghostly encounters, right? I wish that I could say I've seen ghosts chasing me down the halls or bodies mysteriously moving on their own in the morgue, but honestly, nothing quite like that has ever happened. Still, I wouldn't be sharing this if I hadn't experienced anything at all. So to give you a better understanding of the hospital's layout, let me explain where security is stationed. There are 4 main buildings we cover. The first is the main hospital, which houses the emergency room and over 1,000 beds for both kids and adults. We typically have at least 8 guards handling calls in this building, with 1 guard stationed in the emergency room at all times, since that's where most calls come from. It's worth noting that I'm in Canada as well, so anyone can come to the hospital for, well, really any reason, free of charge. The second building, located across the street, is an 8-story medical clinic that requires just 1 guard. This guard also has to patrol the adjacent old clinical building, which is now primarily used for treating children with eating disorders. This is where the story I'm about to share takes place. The last building is the cancer clinic, which requires 2 guards at all times and is the closest to the medical clinic if assistance is needed. So when I first started the job and was shown around the various buildings, the old clinic, which we'll call the asbestos clinic due to its history of asbestos issues, immediately stood out to me. It's a building that, in my opinion, should have been demolished long ago, and during my initial walkthrough, a fellow guard told me that this building was haunted by a young girl who took her own life on the 2nd floor. He also mentioned that the basement was haunted. The whole building used to be a tuberculosis sanatorium back in the 50s and 60s, with tunnels in the basement that were once used to transport bodies. Now, about a month ago, it was my turn to work at the clinic during a night shift, and I was determined to experience some paranormal activity. I had done countless patrols of the asbestos clinic before, but nothing much had happened, aside from the elevators occasionally opening on their own, which was apparently normal. But that night, things changed. I had heard plenty of stories from other guards about strange occurrences in the clinic, but I had never experienced anything myself. I decided to do my patrol at 3 a.m, which is often said to be the prime time for paranormal activity. I began my patrol by walking around the exterior of the building, checking all the entrances to ensure that they were locked. The building closes relatively early, around 8 p.m, so by then it should be completely empty. However, I noticed that one of the exterior doors was slightly open. This concerned me because it had been closed during my first patrol. The building doesn't have any interior cameras, so when something like this happens at night, I have to check every unlocked room inside to make sure that nobody is inside. I entered the building and started my patrol of the first floor, checking every door and hallway. Nobody was there. As I approached the elevator to go up to the 2nd floor, though, I heard a faint creaking sound, like a door opening. At that, I immediately radioed my team lead, informing her that I had found an open door and was hearing noises. I told her that I was going to conduct a thorough patrol, and she sent one of the guards from the cancer clinic, Fred, to assist me. After searching the first floor again and finding nothing, Fred arrived. He told me that he would start searching the 3rd and 4th floors while I covered the 2nd floor and basement. As I was searching the 2nd floor, I heard the same creaking noise again, the sound of a door opening, I think. I radioed Fred to come down, still not considering the possibility of anything paranormal. We've had incidents of homeless people breaking in to find a place to sleep, and though it's rare for them to target the asbestos clinic since it's usually locked, it has happened before. We searched every room on the 2nd floor, but in the end we found nothing. After thoroughly checking the entire clinic, we concluded that nobody was inside. Fred returned to the cancer clinic, and my team lead made a joke that it was probably just a ghost. And that got me thinking, this might be the perfect time to continue my ghost hunting. So I went back into the building, determined to capture some activity. I sat down in a chair on the second floor and I began waiting to see if anything would happen. After about 10 minutes of nothing, I got bored and I decided to head down to the basement. Now, the basement is an eerie place, let me tell you, filled with tunnels that mostly lead to nowhere now. I decided to explore one of them since I had never done it before, and this seemed like the perfect time. Once I exited the elevator, I made my way to one of the locked doors leading to the longest tunnel. Most of the tunnels were completely blocked off, but this one stretched on and on. I unlocked the door and ventured down the tunnel, taking note of my radio beeping to indicate that it had lost signal, a common issue in the basement areas here. As I reached the end of the tunnel, my flashlight started to flicker. I decided to stand still and listen for a bit, and to my shock, I heard a blood-curdling female scream coming from the start of the tunnel. At that, I nearly jumped out of my skin. I turned around, pointing my flickering flashlight back toward the entrance, and started running toward the scream. When I reached the entrance, I tried to radio my team lead, but my radio was still out of signal. I looked around the basement and noticed that one of the doors was open. This door was supposed to be locked, which only security have access to the keys for. I looked inside of the room, but nobody was there. My heart was racing, obviously, and so I closed the door and headed back upstairs to get a radio signal. I was still unsure if I had experienced something paranormal or if somebody had actually broken in, but once I got back to the main floor, I radioed my team lead to let her know what had happened. She sent Fred back to help me investigate the source of the scream. When we arrived, we went back to the basement. I showed him the room that had been opened, and we both noticed a very distinct and strong smell, something like that of a decomposing body. Having spent time in the hospital morgue, I was all too familiar with that smell, and we searched the room, but we couldn't find anything. Fred joked that the room might have been used for tuberculosis patients who didn't make it, but in truth, none of us were sure what that room had been used for. We determined that everything was fine, and I decided that I'd spend enough time in the asbestos clinic for one night. Ever since that experience, though, I've sort of rushed through my patrols in that basement, as that smell still lingers every time I pass that room. So, what do you think? Was this a paranormal experience or something else? Should I investigate further, or should I just let it be? Can you name every single subscription that you have? I know I can't name all of mine, and I'm not alone, because I just learned that over 74% of people have subscriptions that they've forgotten all about. With Rocket Money, though, I don't have to remember every subscription or worry about forgetting any either, because I can see them all laid out right in front of me. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions. It also monitors your spending and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. Rocket Money's dashboard gives you a clear view of your expenses across all of your accounts. Easily create a personalized budget with custom categories to help keep your spending on track. See your monthly spending trends in each category to know exactly where your money is going. Get alerts if bills increase in price, there's unusual spending activity, or if you're close to going over budget. The new goals feature automatically saves money for you without you having to think about it. Whether your goal is to pay off a credit card, put away money for a house, or just build your savings, Rocket Money makes it easy. Honestly, too, I've saved my fair share of money using Rocket Money to cancel a few subscriptions that I didn't even remember that I had, one of which was a D&D map-making subscription that I'd forgotten all about and was still paying for on a monthly basis. It was awesome to fix that up and to finally have that peace of mind, too, that I wasn't forgetting anything any longer. Rocket Money will even try to negotiate lower bills for you, sometimes by up to 20%. They automatically scan your bills to find opportunities to save, then you can ask them to negotiate for you, and they'll deal with the customer service. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in cancelled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's features. So, Stop wasting money on things you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/scared. That's rocketmoney.com/scared. rocketmoney.com/scared. My first experience with the paranormal was actually a string of experiences. I was 16 and my family had just moved into a new home. Honestly, I really loved that house too. I had my own room that I picked myself, and I didn't feel any kind of hesitance while unpacking and decorating to make myself feel more at home. Everything was great. At least for the first week, that is. After school, I would get home with my little brother about an hour before my mum. And one day I was the first one into the home. I threw my bag onto the kitchen table and found my cat stood frozen, staring at a door in the kitchen that led to our garage. I spoke to my cat. "Hey, what are you doing?" I walked towards him, but before I could touch him, a woman's scream came from the garage, and my cat literally sprinted from the room. I followed at that, taking my little brother with me outside and calling my mum. My brother insisted that he didn't hear anything, though, and my mum suggested that I must have imagined it, but I knew that it was real because, well, my cat reacted like that. Once my mum got home, we checked the house to find nothing. She suggested that I was stressed and watching too many scary movies. I didn't bother to argue any further. I could tell that I wasn't going to be believed, so I grabbed my bag and walked to my bedroom at the end of the hall. I stood in the doorway, freezing in my tracks. My closet door was slit open and hanging from its track, as if someone had tried to pull it off, and my pillow was standing in the middle of the room, a flat, flimsy pillow that I couldn't get to stand even if I wanted to. I yelled for my mum. "Someone's been in my room," I accused. She came back, my little brother trailing behind her. I pointed in the room, only to find the pillow now laying flat, as it should have been the whole time. "You must have knocked it off the bed when you woke up this morning." She brushed it off, but I knew that I hadn't, and even if I had, how was it standing like that? I played with the pillow for like several minutes, trying to mimic the position that it had been in, but I just couldn't get it to happen again. I mean, it just seemed impossible to me. I went to bed that night without a problem, and while I did think that what had happened earlier that day was strange, I didn't lose too much sleep over it, but I was prone to waking throughout the night, so, like clockwork, I awoke around 3 in the morning and got up to go to the bathroom. When I returned to my doorway and to my bedroom, I froze. The light from the bathroom shined just barely into my room, making it impossible to miss because I could see a figure sitting on the edge of my bed. It had no features, just the shadow of a large man. I leaned forward, squinting my eyes, trying to adjust my vision to the darkness of my room, but before I could move any further, the figure stood and instantly charged at me. I have never screamed so loud. My feet came out from under me and I hit the floor, my hand flipping on the light before I had lost my balance. And when I looked again, nothing was there. My mum and brother were there in an instant, wondering why I was screaming and now crying on the floor. I tried to explain, but "You were dreaming," my mum told me. I was awake, I was up. I tried to argue, but she just shook her head. "You must have been dreaming," she insisted. "Go back to bed." I didn't sleep well that night. The next day surprisingly went fine. That is, until I was back home from school. That house suddenly didn't feel like home to me, and my room did not feel like mine anymore. I felt like I was invading somebody else's space, and I was sort of apologetic. I then attempted to make a Ouija board out of cardboard and a clear bottle cap, because I was desperate to confirm my own experiences. "Hello," I said quietly, waiting for a response. Nothing. "I'm sorry if we've moved into your home. I'll be a good roommate. I'm very clean." I began to ramble, but the bottle cap, it never moved. I started to feel silly looking down at the makeshift board. It was just trash, really, and so I pushed it away and climbed into bed, embarrassed that I believed such a thing would even work. That night, I heard something rattling around, though. I initially thought that it was a large house moth or something knocking itself onto my window. I flipped on my bedside lamp and noticed that the board on the floor, only the bottle cap, was standing on its side, spinning like a quarter in fast circles. I let out a breath of air in disbelief, and the cap dropped, once again motionless. I jumped out of bed and grabbed the board, tearing it in half and shoving it in the trash. I kept my lamp on for about an hour before I started to feel tired again. Reluctantly, I flipped the lamp off and I drifted to sleep. I always slept with a blindfold on, irritated by the smallest bit of light, so when I awoke again feeling the cold air of my fan, I assumed that I had kicked my blanket off in my sleep. I felt around the bed, trying to find it to cover myself again, but no luck. I lifted my blindfold and I was horrified to see my blanket standing tall above me. It had to have been about 6 feet, towering over my body. I moved quickly, attempting to throw my feet to the side and run to the door, but the blanket fell, and I was forced back to my mattress, a weight suddenly suffocating me, as if somebody had just laid on top of me. I gasped for breath, trying to scream, but not a sound would escape my throat. I remember my eyelids fluttering as I lost consciousness from the lack of air eventually. That morning, I awoke with my blindfold lifted, my blanket tossed to the side of the bed, and pain taking over my body. I knew that I hadn't imagined it, and I came out of my room and I just couldn't stop myself from crying when I found my mum getting ready for work in the bathroom. I tried to explain, but again she didn't believe me. She never believed me, in fact. "You were dreaming," she said to me. "You can stay home from school today. Try and get some rest." I reluctantly nodded and I went back to bed, still scared to really go back to sleep, but I laid stiff and waited for the sound of my mum and brother leaving for the day. I heard the keys jingle and the door close. I was now alone in the home. I rolled into my stomach and cried into my pillow. I was exhausted, in pain, and scared. For several minutes I laid there crying, and then something happened. "I'm sorry about your mum," a man's voice said, clearly beside me. I gasped and sat straight up, but no one was there. I couldn't handle that. I couldn't handle being alone there anymore. So I got out of bed and walked myself to school, something I was usually too scared to do, but not nearly as scared as I was of whatever was in my home. We moved out of the home shortly after due to my mum getting married, and all related activities stopped, much to my relief, but I'll always wonder what it was and why it only seemed to interact with me. That was the first and strongest presence that I've ever encountered. Wendigo, boohags, the wampus, nobby, the skunk ape, all these cryptids have crept in and out of Carolina's and Appalachia's history for centuries, most of which can be quickly disregarded as myth or paranoia. One thing that has always bothered me, though, is when you compare the folklore of Scotland to Appalachia. The names may be different, but the stories and the creatures are the same. When Pangea split, the Scottish Highlands and Appalachia were the same place. Compare these stories with the Atlas Mountains of Morocco, also the same place, and you'll reach the same conclusion. Rural North Carolina is ripe with superstition and always has been. From the flat plains of the Sandhills to the rolling muggy Piedmont area. From Crybaby Bridge to the Devil's Tramping Ground, the supernatural and unexplained grasps the very heart of rural North Carolinas. Now, I admit that the not deer may very well have been a hallucination, but my question for you is, can more than one person have the same hallucination? I am not and never have claimed to be an expert on the paranormal or the occult. Despite my skepticism and belief in my own ability to protect myself, I do believe that something lurks in these woods, and I don't think there's anything anyone or I can do to stop it. Growing up in rural NC, people were always superstitious. The community that I grew up in was a largely agricultural community that still to this day is pretty isolated. My hometown has one gas station, no grocery stores, a population of 161, and one caution light at the crossroads. To have fun, we did the typical things that you'd expect southern kids to do. We rode ATVs, swam in the local ponds, drank cheap booze, and yes, occasionally we'd harass the local cows. I still to this day have never seen some cow tip, but I digress. One thing we used to do growing up, though, is go snipe hunting. It's a prank that you always play on an outsider or a new kid to the group who'd never played the game before. A snipe is a small flightless bird common, or to the story passed down claimed, in the Carolinas that's relatively easy to catch. The premise is simple. The group and the unsuspecting butt-of-the-joke player would walk as far as you could into the woods. The player being pranked would be given a trash bag to carry. That player was supposed to hold the bag to the ground for as long as it takes while the rest of the group chased the snipe into the bag. However, the catch was as simple as it was mean. The group, after leading the new player into the woods, would abandon him in the woods. Usually the player would get the hint and come walking back relatively soon. I was, unfortunately, the player being pranked on April 18th of 2005, my 11th birthday. I had been inducted into this awful game by 3 of my older cousins and their group of friends. I just wanted to be a part of these 8th and 9th graders groups so bad that I would have done anything, to be honest. Living there, I had one neighbor to my right who was my widowed uncle, and then not another house in sight. Really just tobacco and soybeans as far as the eye could see. These were my closest friends and the only kids that I ever hung out with. To give you a little bit of perspective on just how small our community is, my graduating high school class in 2012, it had 21 students in it in total. My entire high school, grades 9 to 12, did not equal to 1/20th of the size of my wife's graduating class. Anyway, so I'm standing in the middle of this swampy, muggy, moss-covered, dark forest waiting for my friends to chase a small bird into my trash bag. It's just past dawn and the woods are getting darker and darker every minute. We were never allowed to go into the woods at night growing up. I was no novice to the woods. I was a Boy Scout my entire life up to this point, and had traveled through most of the woods in my area. The woods, they can be a weird place though. Even during the brightest time of the day, take a moment to look into them as you drive. Despite the brightness, you can never see more than 15 to maybe 20 feet into the woods from the street before it gets dark again. When the sun sets, even if the moon is full, the woods become an eerily dark place very quickly. Have you ever heard a deer make a distress signal to another deer? It almost sounds like a loud sneeze with a slight whistle to it. It's pretty distinct and actually a little bit funny to hear. Like the deer is telling his friends, "Yo, there's a kid over here holding a bag, let's bounce." Anyway, I heard a quick 2 of these sounds and chuckled to myself as I kept holding that trash bag. Another thing I'd like all of you outdoor activists to keep in mind while I'm telling you this is, like I said, I grew up in the woods, did Boy Scouts, I've hunted deer, bear, bobcat, boar, coyote, and elk. It's not the sounds of the forest that should bother you, though. It's actually the absence of sounds that really should bother you. Animals like owls, other raptor species, crickets, beavers, cicadas, etc. are not inadvertently scared of humans. I mean, sure, if you walk within 3 feet of the crickets in that area, they'll definitely stop chirping. But the area all around you will still be louder than your TV at 50% with crickets, owls, and cicadas. Anyway, after about 3 hours in the woods, I began to get tired and sat down with my back against a large pine tree. I was starting to get the idea that this was a bit of a joke as I hadn't heard my friends yelling for hours at this point. The crickets chirping and the owl hooting were actually really relaxing and peaceful, and if I wasn't soaked and wet, I probably could have really just slept there that night. It's pitch black in these woods, loud as any night before, and I'm alone with a few owls, crickets, and cicadas. But at the drop of a pin, without a moment's notice, suddenly, there's just dead silence. No crickets chirping, no owls hooting, no cicadas singing. It took a few moments for me to realize how quiet it actually became. I looked around, but it was obviously useless. Nothing but really blackness in every direction. Growing up hunting with my grandfather, I was always taught to be quieter than your heartbeat, especially when the woods go quiet like this. It usually means that a predator is around, like a black bear, maybe a bobcat, or perhaps a coyote or something. I slowed my breathing until I could hear my heart slowly beat, and beat and beat again. But I never heard a sound. No steps in the leaves, no bear marking a tree, no coyote huffing and puffing. I listened so intently to the point that all I could hear was the echo of my heartbeat getting faster in my own ears. But then, a whistle. This had to have been a human whistle, though. It was so clear and had rhythm. Like, imagine a cowboy calling in a herd. It was a bit like that. It was a quick whip whistle that was no more than maybe 25, 30 feet behind me. I assumed it was one of my cousins looking for me, but for some reason, every fiber in my being told me to not move and to not turn around. Do not make a sound was the only thing going through my head at the time. My brain was trying to protect me, I think, and if that was my subconscious going into prey mode to save me from pain, well, I'm thankful, but I don't know. Maybe it was my instinct trying to warn me. Again, I'm not really sure, but if it had been my cousins, I would have definitely heard them walking up at the minimum. In fact, most likely they would have been yelling for me to come back to the house on their way to retrieve me. The hair on my neck suddenly stood up and my heart began to race like I was running a marathon. Another whistle, this time less human, more screechy, almost mimicking a human like a bad parrot. Still no footsteps. Not a single other sound in these woods, in fact, besides my heart about to jump out of my chest. Another whistle, and this time no more than 10 feet behind me. It was congested, screeching, and definitely not a deer. A disgusting, putrid smell filled the air all around me suddenly, like a chain smoker's sigh after they come back inside combined with the smell of like roadkill. Then, dead silence again. I couldn't have moved an inch, even if you had offered to pay me $1 million at this stage. I swear my mind went into prey mode. I was already dead. No point in struggling and making it worse. I sat with my back against that pine tree for at least 45 minutes, taking as small of breaths as I could and being absolutely as quiet as I could, but dead silence still. I must have sat there for 45 minutes or so. And then the smell disappeared, the crickets began to chirp once more, the owl who had been silently observing what I thought was going to be my demise from above let out a single hoot, the cicadas began to sing, and my stomach finally settled back into my chest. I thought to myself that I've got to get out of these woods, so I drop the trash bag and stand up and begin my roughly 1-mile walk back home. As that bag hits the ground and I take my first step, dead silence again. I, standing at this point, begin the process all over of being dead still, but this time no whistle. This time just a single deep breath, probably inches behind me, and again that putrid smell. With every muscle in my body telling me not to, I still turned my head a little bit around to look at the pine tree behind me. Antlers were wrapping around both sides of the tree, only inches from where my shoulders sat. Then a single tone, the quietest, calmest, warmest, most enticing, welcoming, short, and sweet whistle that I think I've ever heard. Instantly, though, the crickets went berserk, like summer instantly became winter. The owls invited friends, and they were all screaming. The cicadas were no longer singing, they were just belting. At that, I turned, and I just ran with everything that I had in my body left. Every 10 or so feet, I'd glance over my shoulder. Not a footstep in pursuit. No antler moving, nothing. Just the absolute chaos and echo of the woods in utter darkness. I finally made it to the clearing of the pasture, and hop under the electric fence. The woods are still screaming at me to run, but I've got to catch my breath. Then there's dead silence again. A single whistle comes from the woods no more than just beyond the first set of trees, and when I hear that, I run all the way home and I never look back. I get home at around 7:30 a.m. and the sun is coming up finally. All my cousins and friends are passed out on the couch after an all-nighter Halo session. I sit down and lean my head back to try and forget and just sleep. I'm starting to finally daze off when I look out the window towards the woods. It's still just as dark in those woods as it was the night before. But out of the corner of my eye, I see something black, so I jump up and wake my cousin Daniel to get his rifle with a scope. He laughs his head off and he hands me the Ruger, because apparently the black trash bag that I had left in the woods somehow had made its way out. My sister and I went to the beach yesterday since it's still warm out in New York and we wanted to get some sun. Since it's after Labor Day and schools are back in session, there are no lifeguards there and really it's pretty isolated. We arrived around 11 in the morning and there was a couple sitting near us, as well as a man who was walking in the sand with his headphones in. Around 1 p.m., the couple who was sitting near us left the beach. The man who was walking in the sand was still there, and further in the distance were two women sitting on their beach chairs. My sister was sitting in her beach chair, and I decided to lay on my stomach to get the back of my body more tanned. When all of a sudden I hear my sister say in a very fearful voice to me, "There's a man coming toward us." But the man who was walking the beach with his headphones in came walking toward us, swinging his arms back and forth. I immediately got up, and he was now on the edge of my beach blanket. Both my sister and I panicked in the moment and basically froze. I asked him if he needed something, but he didn't say anything. He just stared at my sister and me. My sister said, "Let's get our belongings and let's just go." We got off our beach blanket and we exited the beach, but the whole encounter really had my sister and I shaken up. I mean, I don't know what he was going to do to us or if he would have been waiting for us in the parking lot or what. But the look in his eyes is something I'll never forget. We immediately contacted the police after this and we filed a report. Back in 2009, when I was 19, I was dating this girl who was 21. I was in college and living at home with my mum. My girlfriend and I had been together for about a year at this point. She had been invited to a co-worker's party in a nearby town. I wasn't feeling well that night though, so I decided to stay home. Now, to get from our town to the co-worker's town, you had to drive through a long stretch where it was just woods on both sides of you. I think it was late fall at that time, so it was getting darker earlier. She was driving home at around 7:30 or 8 o'clock when she called me from that wooded road just to chat along the way. But the call ended suddenly. You might be thinking the call got dropped because, well, she was driving through a wooded area, right? And that's what I thought too. She called back almost immediately. I answered the phone, but it wasn't her. It was a deep voice, but it was completely clear. What I mean by clear is that it wasn't like staticky or anything. To this day, I 100% maintain that it was not radio interference too. Anyway, the voice was deep, clear, and sounded urgent and angry. It was speaking in a language I've never heard before. It wasn't German, French, Romanian, Spanish, or whatever. It might be dramatic to say this too, but the voice didn't sound, well, human. I wish that I could somehow record my thoughts so that I could post the memory of this voice for all of you to hear because it was just indescribable. I remember sitting there though. I was in my bedroom at the time, completely frozen, holding the phone to my ear. I eventually got up in a panic and ran to my mum in the living room. I handed her the phone and frantically said, "Please listen to this." But as soon as she put it to her ear, the phone hung up. Just like before, my girlfriend called back almost immediately. I hesitated to pick it up this time, but when I did, It was actually her. And the first thing out of her mouth was, "What the heck was that?" According to her, I'm the one that called her back, and when she picked up, she heard the same voice that I did. We're still on good terms to this day. We broke up maybe a year after this incident, but whenever we see each other, we're both like, "Remember that phone call that we had?" Whenever I bring it up, people say it's radio interference or I picked up another call somehow. I'm willing to accept a non-paranormal explanation if it's a good one, but it was definitely not radio interference, so do you have any other suggestions or thoughts? So I don't encounter much these days regarding the paranormal. However, I remember a distinct day as a kid that I'll never forget. My grandmother of Vietnamese descent used to tell stories of her ability to sense the presence of unearthly beings dating all the way back to her childhood. The earliest story that she recounts is walking home from school with her friends along an abandoned railroad in Vietnam. She recalled an old tale of a lantern shining in the distance that will lure you into following it, and described it as a trap that would intentionally lead you far away from where you were intending to go. Long story short, she and her friends began following this lantern that never seemed to get closer to them. This went on until it was dark outside, and she realized that she had been following this light for hours. She was told as a child about this phenomenon when she was younger, as I mentioned previously. Her parents told her that apparently the only way to rid yourself of this is to wipe urine onto your face. I know that sounds questionable at best, but these were her words. Apparently once they did that too, they snapped out of it. Fast forward to my childhood though, and her later years in the States, she claimed that there was a dark portal in the room attached to my childhood bedroom. I'm not sure why she chose to mention this at a family dinner of all places, but our family was very open about these things as my entire dad's side was practicing Buddhism and believed in these things. Well, one day when I was 14 or so, I decided to ditch summer camp and walk home. About 2 miles, I think, and I got home at around mid-afternoon. I shower and start watching the show Weeds on Netflix, when I see my mum walk outside of my room towards the air conditioning control panel. She never turned to look at me or anything, didn't even acknowledge the fact that I was home, when I wasn't supposed to be, let alone the fact that she wasn't at work for some reason. There was no exchange of words or anything. She then proceeds to walk towards the living room, away from my bedroom and hallway, only to find out hours later that the garage opens and she got back from work. She questioned why I was home and I told her. Also, I told her I literally saw her a few hours ago outside of my room, only to be told that she was never home. The figure, though, was definitely my mother. I mean, without a doubt. To the point that when I initially saw the figure, I had no anxiety or any fear. I just assumed that she was home or something. I mean, I was cozy watching my show, so I figured she wasn't trying to bother me. But no, she wasn't even there to begin with. I told my grandma this story a bit later, and she told me that she saw a version of my deceased grandmother in that hallway as well at one point. I never really believed in the paranormal. I certainly didn't believe my grandma's story. I mean, urine on the face and all that. But this story, it seriously still gives me goosebumps and honestly makes me question myself. So I moved with my mum to her new boyfriend's when I was 11. I'd experienced a few weird things in my life by this point. The house was very run down and outdated before my mum redecorated, and I was put in a nicely sized room in comparison to my old one. Younger siblings get the smallest, right? But like I say, it was very outdated. I'd had a few nights here and felt uneasy, I guess, but I assumed that was due to the drastic change me and my mum went through. I'd heard banging, running up the stairs, you name it. Anyway, it was day. I often caught glimpses of something through the crack of my door and had a look, but nothing was ever there. I got into the habit of looking through the crack and then entering my room. So I did just that, saw nothing through the crack, and then entered my room. But I froze in place because there stood a woman with dark, permed hair. She was facing away from me, but I could tell that she was old by her arms and posture. She was stood near my window at the right side of my bed. Naturally, I was terrified and glad that I slept on the left. I ran down in a panic and screaming and told my mum that I saw an elderly lady in my room. She didn't quite believe me at first, but was freaked out too. We left it there so that we didn't scare ourselves too much. A few days passed and I walked in from school to my mum in the kitchen. She said that she'd spoken to the neighbour about me seeing an old lady in my room. The neighbour said how there was a lady that lived there before my mum's boyfriend moved in, and her bedroom was the one that I was staying in. And apparently she had died in my bedroom and was discovered a few days later. So that was creepy. That didn't freak me out too much, I guess, as that is the case for most houses. What scared me, though, was when Mum asked me what colour was her hair. I thought that it was weird that she asked me, but I said, funnily enough, she had dark hair instead of grey. Mum's face instantly dropped and said the neighbour told her that she used to dye her hair dark into her later years. I didn't believe her and thought that she was just trying to freak me out, so I ended up trying to call her bluff. Mum tried to scare me most days for her entertainment, but she insisted the conversation happened. I was skeptical until my mum decorated my room. The wardrobe, it was full of old ladies' clothes and men's shoes, and under the carpet, and I swear that this is true, to the right of my bed by the window, there was a patch of decomposition staining. Gross, right? Safe to say my mum's boyfriend is gross, and I hated that room forever after. So I've been hesitant to share this, but I think it's time. What happened to me and my family in our old home, it still chills me to the bone. A few years ago, my family moved into a large old house that had been in my family for generations. It's a beautiful place with a lot of character, but from the moment that we moved in, something always felt off. The first sign was the constant feeling of just being watched. We would frequently hear footsteps when nobody was around, and doors would open and close on their own too. My parents brushed it off as the house settling or old plumbing and all that, but I certainly wasn't convinced. And one night, I was home alone while my parents were out. I was in the living room watching some TV when I heard someone calling my name from upstairs. Honestly, it sounded like my mum, but when I went up to check, the house was obviously empty. I called out but got no response. I checked every room, but nobody was there. A few nights later, while I was trying to sleep, I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder. I turned around to find nothing but the dark, empty room. My heart was racing, though, and I barely slept that night. The final straw came one evening, though, when we were having a family dinner. A picture frame fell off the wall and shattered on the floor, and when we picked it up, the picture was of a woman that we didn't recognize. We had never seen her before, and she wasn't a relative. My parents did some research and found out that the woman had lived in the house decades before and had died under mysterious circumstances. Since then, we've had the house blessed and tried to ignore the strange occurrences, but the feeling of unease just never fully went away. I still wonder who or what was trying to communicate with us there, and I'm wondering if anybody else has experienced something like this. I would love to hear your thoughts, or if you have any advice on dealing with a haunting, because, honestly, I have no idea. My 10-year-old daughter, well, she sleep talks. Sometimes she'll even sit up and look around a bit. And last night, she dozed off on the couch, and 15 minutes later, she sat up and said, "Where did it go?" I said, "It's okay, honey, go back to bed." She laid down and asked me again where it went. I said, "Go back to sleep." and then I immediately heard a man's voice right in front of me say no. I looked at my daughter and she was asleep again. My husband was in another part of the house in our bedroom asleep, and honestly, I'm still very shaken. There was a man who passed away in our living room in 2017. There was also a man who shot his wife in the head with a shotgun in 1986 in the driveway across the street. We also live by a cemetery, like next door, I mean. I never really felt spooked as well until, well, last night, and I haven't slept. The voice was so aggressive, and I just hate this so much. It was close, and it was real. I don't know how else to explain it. I've asked my daughter if she ever has dreams about ghosts or sees ghosts, but she said no. I asked if she thought the house was haunted, and she said, well, there are the dimes. I forgot about the dimes. Apparently they fall on her. She has so many dimes now because of this too. We rarely use cash though, and she has a reloadable cash card, so we have no idea where they came from. Like, for instance, she'll be in the kitchen and I'll hear a coin hit the floor. She'll say, thanks, Jeff, and put it in her bank in her room, and I honestly forgot about all that. I didn't tell her what happened last night because, quite honestly, I think it will terrify her. The dogs, too. We have 3 boxer dogs that heard it as well. When I told my husband about what had happened, he asked me if that's why the girls woke him up scratching at the bedroom door trying to get out. They usually all pile in bed with us. I heard them scratching at the door, but not until much later, and I had gotten up after my heart calmed down and decided to go pee once more before crashing for the night. The dogs, though, they never do this. They go to bed when he goes to bed, and they stay there all night. Also, just now my daughter actually said to me, do you think people can talk to ghosts? Do consider that we went to the new Beetlejuice movie after school yesterday, so that could be related, but I said, well, anything's possible. My grandpa always said, if someone said that they saw this or that, never dismiss it because, well, you just never know. My daughter then said, isn't he the grandpa that worked in the Air Force at Roswell's, the alien place? I said, yeah, Roswell. She asked, did he believe in aliens and ghosts? I replied, oh, yeah, he had an author that he loved that talked about supernatural encounters all the time. I cannot remember his name, but my grandma would say that he was crazy when he'd bring this sort of thing up. She said, well, she wasn't lucky enough to see that sort of stuff, I guess. I said, why do you ask? And she said, oh, I was just curious. Also, Jeff, the man who died in our house, he was a nice guy and a bit of a family friend. We've always said Jeff jokingly, and we've agreed that if he were to do anything, that he's obviously nice, if he's leaving us money. The voice I heard was forceful, though, and almost angry. Nothing has happened since then, and my daughter has seemed unfazed. I've also been sleeping a lot better. Well, after a couple of days, that is. So, a little bit of context is that, at the time of this, I was actually being pimped out by my partner. It was early night time, and I was getting ready for work. There were ad posters for me on a couple of different sites, and we had snagged what we thought could be a big fish. I messaged this John for about half an hour before agreeing on a house call. The house was completely across the street, in a very wealthy neighborhood. The John told me to let me know when I arrived. He was working on his PC in an upstairs bedroom or something. My partner and I got into the car and drove to the address provided. He always waited nearby while I worked, but when we arrived to this house, we both felt, well, really uneasy. I messaged the John once I was in the driveway, to no response. I got out and started to approach the door, and my partner came with me. The door was large and made of heavy wood, with a fancy frosted glass window in the center. When I knocked, I realized that it was actually ajar. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly pushed the door open wide. The interior of the house confused me further, though. I was faced with a short hallway leading into a grand living space. There was a beautiful fireplace in the center, complete with a crackling fire going. To my left, I noticed a dark doorway. But the strangest thing of all was the lack of furniture. From the front door where I stood, I could see nearly the entire living room. There wasn't even a single chair. No photos on the wall, nothing but the fire in the fireplace. I stood frozen in the doorway for a moment. My partner stepped past me into the house. I started to flee, but curiosity and fear kept me locked in place. He stepped forward and looked into the doorway to the left. He recoiled a bit and shouted, "Hello, hello," a few times. He turned to me and shoved me out of the doorway, and at this point, I found my legs again and sprinted to the car. We drove in stunned silence for a moment until we stopped at an all-night pharmacy. I asked softly, "What was in that room?" He said, very slowly, "An air mattress with 2 people on it, sleeping. Well, I hope." This is something that I experienced at and below the age of 6. It's something that I still think about now as a 37-year-old and have some vivid memories of. So, in the first house I lived in, I shared a room with my older brother. It was a small house with tiny rooms, so we slept in bunk beds with me on the bottom. My parents are somewhere on the hoarder spectrum, and as such, there was a lot of stuff packed into our small room. One item in particular was a stuffed Afghan dog that my mum had made. At the time, it felt like it was huge, and it had a very distinct, pointy face with plastic eyes glued on. It was actually stuffed with old tights and made a distinct noise when you moved it. My mum called it Arabella Afghan, and she stayed at the bottom of my bed with some other toys. To add a bit more context too, I was born in 1987. My maternal grandfather died in 1985, and as such never met any of his grandchildren. I remember my mum speaking about him a lot as a kid, saying how old he would have been when his birthday came around and generally telling us about him. I know that she missed him a lot, and she said to me one day that she had regretted not telling him she loved him before he died. Now, I'm not suggesting that this definitely happened, as I know that the imagination of a child can be very active. However, the events that I'm about to tell you at least felt real to young me. So with all that said, here's what happened. Arabella, she would come to life in the night. I would hear the distinct noise of her moving and bury my head under my pillow so that I wouldn't see her, or she wouldn't see me, and just wait until the noise stopped. One night in particular, though, I woke up and felt like I just wanted to be with my parents, so I got out of bed, made myself as small as possible with my eyes shut, and waited for the noise to stop so that I could run to my parents' room. On this occasion, though, a man's voice said, "You're a good boy," then the noise stopped, and I was absolutely terrified, and I ran. Another night, I heard the noise and looked over the end of my bed. Arabella was looking directly at me, which terrified me, so I immediately hid under my covers. I can still picture exactly how it looked in my mind's eye, too. Her plastic eyes locked with mine. On one very distinct occasion, I remember playing in my room by myself and a man's voice saying something like, "Don't worry," or "You're okay," although there was no one there. My dad was in the Air Force too and spent a lot of time away when I was very young, and during this time I'm fairly sure that he was in the Falklands and there was no other man in the house. I also remember saying to my mum one day, "Sometimes I hear God talking to me," which must have been where my young brain went to make sense of it all. But it's not really something that I talk about to people. This place, though, felt like it was somewhere that I could talk about it from a neutral standpoint. I do like to think that it was connected to my grandfather in some way, not least because it would have come from a place of love for my brothers and mother, especially seeing as I never got to meet him, but to be honest, I really don't know. So I used to be a paranormal investigator as a hobby, and thought that I'd share my most memorable encounter with all of you guys. Now, there was a house in Corinth, New York that I investigated several times, partially because we got more interesting stuff there than anywhere else, but mostly because the woman living there was scared of her daughter. She thought that she might be possessed due to her change in behavior, sudden mood swings, depression, all of that. This family's home had been in their name for generations, and they knew of 2 people who had died in the home. They also believed that, well, many years ago, somebody had performed some type of witchcraft in the attic. Anyway, let me get to the specific encounter. So my team and I were in the kitchen with her doing an EVP session. We didn't feel much of a presence, and we're getting ready to wrap up the session when suddenly the temperature under the table that we were sitting at felt like it dropped 20 degrees at least. I had a one-touch thermometer with me, so I quickly scanned the air above and below the table, and sure enough, there was a stark difference in the temperature. This woman's mother was one of the people who had passed in the home. In fact, she had died right in the kitchen that we were sitting in, so I looked at the woman and told her that I had a feeling that her mother might be with us, and asked if she had anything she wanted to ask her or anything she wanted to say to her. She started talking. I don't recall much of what she said, but the things I don't remember are sort of irrelevant to this anyway, because what I do remember was when she suddenly paused, looked up and said very softly, "Do you remember that squirrel we used to feed every day? Do you remember what we called him?" Long story short, I reviewed the audio about a week later, after she asked that question. I could see that there was an audio fluctuation, so I queued it up and listened with headphones on full blast to see if I could hear what was said, and it sounded like Nuthead. It took me a few times listening to it to decide that that was definitely what I was hearing. And well, I went back to the house a few days later to go over the evidence that we captured with her. There was other stuff, but not as compelling, but when we got to this audio clip, I took out a piece of paper and wrote Nuthead on it, and hid it so nobody could see. I played the clip for her and asked her to tell me what she heard. After playing the clip, this woman just literally broke down in tears. Instead of waiting for a response with regards to what she had heard, I put the piece of paper down in front of her for her to read, and she started bawling even harder. Because Nuthead was apparently the name that her mother had coined for this squirrel. We talked to her mother that day in that kitchen. It's pretty wild to think about, and I still get goosebumps as I write about it now. This was probably 20 years ago now, but it's something that has stuck with me all this time. I want to preface by saying that I'm definitely a skeptic. I've had a few different experiences in my life, but this is the only one that I can't definitively logic my way out of. And it's a bit of a long story too, so please bear with me. Now, before I joined the military, I lived in South Florida, about 40 miles south of Tampa. It was around my sophomore year of high school, and we just moved into a new house, and I was a very tired kid. I need to include as well that I was on ADHD and antidepressant medication, as that's the only way that I can explain part of this, but the side effects included drowsiness and, well, go figure, nightmares. It started with almost nothing, to be honest. My dog would walk into my room and I'd say hi, and she'd almost immediately sprint out. One time she just stared at my closet and sort of shook. She's a rescue, so I just assumed at the time that it was some form of anxiety. If she did stay in my room, though, she hated getting on my bed, and if she did, she'd get off after maybe a minute or two, even if I was petting her. After a couple of months, so maybe around Christmas, things started to change, though. I'd come home almost every single day and crash in my room for an hour or two, and during this time I started to have very vivid, even realistic nightmares. The nightmares would start like I was waking up or still lying in bed, and I'd feel my head was super fuzzy, like I was lightheaded all of a sudden. I'd try to sit up and feel crushing weight on my chest. If I wrestled free, I'd try to get out of bed, but all I could do was sit up, like my legs just wouldn't work. I even remember being able to shimmy my way forward like I was crawling out of bed, and something pulled me back into it rather aggressively. This continued for about a month or two, and that's when things got worse. The nightmares evolved to something much worse. So, you know how in dreams you often recognize a place, but it doesn't really at all look like the place? This isn't one of those times. In fact, every detail of my room was exactly how it was normally, only I wasn't dreaming from my perspective. I was sort of looking in. It was a out-of-body experience, I guess you could say, and I would be standing in the middle of my room seeing myself sleep. If my room was messy and, let's say, a red shirt was on the ground before I went to sleep, it was in that exact spot in the nightmare. Backpack by the door, posters on the wall, the whole 9 yards. Anyway, during these nightmares, I'd watch my comforter compress on my chest and feel my breathing become hindered. I'd watch my head on my pillow as it jolted and could feel something hit my face. This particular instance would go on until I graduated high school. Almost every time, my mum would ask why I was such a rough sleeper, because I'd always have red marks on my neck or scratches somewhere. One time it was so distinct on my neck, I could count the fingers or the marks from them. Ever since I joined the military, and I've been on my ship or my apartment, I've never had any experiences like that, even when I visit my home. I will say this, though. I've noticed that my dog, to this day, will not stay in my room for very long at all. To give you some context, I'm a 26-year-old woman, best friend of S, also 26 years old. Since her childhood, strange things have been happening with her paternal family, and I have personally witnessed bizarre events on 3 occasions. My best friend S lives part of the year with her uncle on a piece of land where there is a mobile home. Surrounded by several houses and land belonging to her family, S is of Romani descent. She no longer has contact with her parents, who were abusive and abandoned their children, which explains why she's been living with her uncle for several years now. Now, since she was young, S has told me about strange occurrences happening at her brother's or grandmother's and uncle's and even her parents' house. A very tall man sometimes appears at night and regularly watches them. These appearances occur randomly, whether it's raining, windy, snowing in summer or winter. This man, whose face is always unrecognizable, seems to stand in certain spots to spy on them late at night. At first glance, this could be dismissed as a case of stalking, I admit, but what is truly unsettling is that this man has been around for not just 1 or 2 years, but since the childhood of S's aunts and uncles. This man has been tracking them for generations, it seems. The strangest thing of all, though, is that every time someone tries to confront him, it's impossible to get close. The man seems to move away very quickly without running, and sometimes he completely disappears when he is actively searched for. For instance, S's cousin once tried to catch him, but whenever he went out with friends or uncles, this man had completely vanished. What makes this situation even more disturbing, though, is that whenever he appears, there is an intense feeling of discomfort that affects everyone, even those far from the area where he is seen. Now, the first time S saw him, she was 6 years old, and had gotten up to drink a glass of water. She saw a man standing very close to the patio door. To give you an idea of how tall he is, she could only see his shoulders, not his head. She called her mother, who also saw him and was frozen in fear. The family dog at the time began whining. After several minutes, this man backed away and hid or, disappeared. The second time, she was at her grandmother's house when she spotted a very tall, motionless man looking in the direction of one of her uncle's plots. Her cousin, who started having a panic attack, also noticed him too. Her uncles and father tried to approach him, but he quickly moved away without actually running. They still couldn't see his face when they got close, too. And the third time was when I was with her at her uncle's place. She heard her dogs whining, and her uncle, who is usually a heavy sleeper, suddenly woke up, grabbed a baseball bat, and went outside trembling to confront this guy. But as soon as he stepped outside, the man seemed to evaporate into the vegetation. The land is a fairly wooded area. Now, here are some questions that I've received, and I'll try to give some answers to them. Why do they think it's the same man? Well, because of his height and the way that he flees. But what doesn't make sense is that it's been happening since the childhood of S's aunts and uncles, so this man should be very old by now. And that's really unsettling to think about, but he's never tried to approach anyone or talk or leave a message or anything. It's just really bizarre. What about the police? Well, they only called the police twice. Being from a Romani background, even though they are settled, they aren't always taken seriously by law enforcement. An investigation was opened at one stage, but it didn't lead to anything. Has no one ever managed to catch him? As mentioned earlier, never. And it's weird, too, that despite attempts to chase or confront him and his disappearances, this man still seems to linger around. Why consider something supernatural? Well, S and some members of her family are almost convinced of it. First, because of his apparent age, and then because they have never been able to catch him. And despite the investigation, there were no footprints, no DNA, no signs of forced entry, nothing tangible, I guess you could say. What about photos or videos? At night, on land surrounded by forest and without streetlights or city lights, they tried, but you could barely see anything. Even the installation of surveillance cameras was a failure, which reinforced the theory that this man might not be human, well, according to them anyway. Personally, I am a believer and have seen strange things before, but what happens at my best friend's place from time to time is really frightening. Especially the reactions of the dogs, who seem to panic as soon as this man is around. This leads me to think that it might be a spirit or maybe a jinn haunting the area. S's favorite uncle thinks that it might not be the same man, but if it is, he's one heck of a degenerate or a pervert, is what he says, because to stalk a family for 40 years requires serious determination. So my question for all of you guys is, do you have any idea as to what this is, what his intentions might be, anything? Because that too remains a real mystery. So when I was in my bedroom, my mum was in the living room with the lights off. This happened at around 8:30 p.m. and it's now past 10. My mum heard me come down the hallway and into the kitchen. She asked if I was okay, and she apparently heard a bit of a mumble back in my voice. She said that she didn't know what it said, but after that, the kitchen lit up as if I was using my phone flashlight to find something, and then it was gone. After that, she texted me to ask if I had been out of the living room, so I got up and left my room to talk to her and tell her that I hadn't. I had actually been in my room working on a project for at least the last few hours. So now, we're both freaking out. She kept asking if I was messing with her, and I swore that I wasn't. But we have been experiencing a few things here and there, actually, like strange noises, things moving around. My dad has also had a few of his own experiences. I think one was also about me, so whatever it is, it seems to keep impersonating me. I'm not sure if it's entirely related, but for the past year or so I've been feeling this very off energy around me as well. I've never been able to see ghosts, but I've been able to feel them, I think. Their energies and such, but this one is just off. The only way that I could describe it is wrong, and it's very inconsistent for when it shows up. Sometimes it's gone for a week and it comes back, or it's every other day sometimes, multiple nights in a row, etc. I also really only ever feel it in my room, sometimes elsewhere in the house, and it's always or usually at night anyway. I'm also not sure if they are related, and if they are, I'm not sure how to get rid of this thing, so if you have any advice, I would love it. I'm not a Christian or not religious or anything, so I wouldn't feel comfortable getting the house blessed or anything, which is part of the reason why I'm here. What does anyone do about the paranormal if they aren't religious? One rainy night back in my old apartment, the power went out, and so we bonded through conversations and genuine human interactions, just as we all should, really. One of my friend's demeanors, though, suddenly changed, almost as if he was struck by lightning that froze his soul, and just as instantaneously began to gradually melt away into something that looked like fear. Slowly, he walked into the kitchen, which required a glass door to be slid open to the left before the kitchen hall could be seen. It was a studio apartment. He stared at the direction of the cupboards near the sink for nearly a minute, and due to curiosity and a mix of irritation and anxiety, me and my other friend peeked in to see what he was looking at. We remained silent. I don't remember who went first, but we all eventually ended up chilling back in the room and carried on with our conversations. When we ran out of things to say, I finally said, "You all saw it too, didn't you?" No one spoke, and honestly, that was all the answer I needed. It was a shadowy figure of a man, presumably with a walking stick and a high hat. He was leaned against the countertop, and he appeared to be grinning, I would say. He didn't move an inch or display any hints whatsoever to whatever his intentions may have been, but he was just there. This was in 2002, and a month ago I saw him again. It was only me and a friend who were the last two people awake out of the group of around 7 people. I saw him, and the longer it went, the more the fear in my heart grew. The more he grew in size as well, it seemed. He didn't really grow in the typical sense of the word, though. He grew as, I believe, a direct manifestation of how much fear I perceived him with. My friend saw the terror on my face and told me that he believed me before I even said anything about it. In the afternoon, when everybody was finally awake, one of our friends revealed that another of our friend, a known and respected street dude, also had the same experience and was frozen in fear as a result of what he had seen. I'm wondering, though, is anyone familiar with this entity or what it could be? Why does it appear, and what is its usual agenda? It only ever disappears, too, every time I tell it that I'm not afraid, that I don't fear it, and I must mean it when I say it, too, it seems. This only happens at the sight of him, though, and then he disappears slowly into a sort of misty nothingness as he grins subtly and perhaps even sort of giggles, I think. Or at least grins in a giggly manner, I guess you could say. But has anyone else seen or heard of anything like this before? Because I'm wondering if maybe I'm going crazy, or maybe there's something going on in my house that I'm just not aware of. This experience is one that I've never shared with anyone besides my brother. When I was about 13 years old, I was living in rural BC. One night I was in the hot tub on the deck outside just watching the woods, taking in the silence. It was winter time, and we had just recently had a snowfall that left around knee-high deep of snow. It was around 2 to 3 in the morning, and out of nowhere, this large wolf, bigger than one that I'd ever seen by far, came out of the woods. I remember its coat being a shimmering silver and its bright piercing green eyes. As this wolf was walking along the fence of our paddocks, it sort of locked eyes with mine, and we just kind of stared at each other as he walked past me, both alone in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere. But what happened next, till this day, always makes my spine shiver. As the wolf walked past, he walked towards our barn with our horses in it. It became darker as it entered the barn, but the other side of the barn still had a bright light illuminating the outside that I could clearly see. And this wolf, as it entered, halfway through it went from the shape of a wolf to a very large, broad-shouldered person. The horses didn't make a single sound, and this person, that now stood roughly 7 feet tall, rounded the corner towards the open field, but didn't emerge from the other side, and after that I never saw it again. My brother had his own encounter with this same wolf, I think. He told me that he woke up randomly one night from the feeling of being watched. He then looked out of his window to see a very large wolf walking away from his window, so I'm guessing that it was watching him sleep or something. This place that we lived at was old native ground. Our barn was an old schoolhouse where the Catholic priest would put the native children and teach them lessons on Christ and all that. It even had the old desk and chairs inside still. My brother and I saw children's faces in the panes of glass from that barn, and lights turning on randomly too. We had closet doors slam repeatedly for minutes at a time, footsteps and feelings of being watched. In my room I saw glowing red eyes on the ceiling one time, and hid under my covers until morning. Anyway, the main reason why I'm sharing this and what I'm really seeking answers for is, what did I encounter outside in the middle of the night that night? After I looked around myself, the closest thing that I could find was skinwalkers or wendigos, but from what I've read of these creatures, they have deformed features or things that make them uncanny or straight up horrific. What I saw, nothing struck me as abnormal about this wolf besides its massive size, until it literally changed its entire form in front of me. I know that this is getting a bit long, but I'm not a great storyteller, and there's just so much that I experienced at this property that this is really just scratching the surface to everything else. The wolf incident is just something that I've never really been able to grasp and always wanted some kind of an answer for because it feels and sounds just so unbelievable. I know that. I also understand that the term skinwalker is Navajo lore and doesn't really correlate with the BC tribes, but this is just a representation of what I saw with, well, the closest accuracy that I can give you all. I've been living in this apartment for, well, almost a year now, I think, and I haven't had any experiences up until this last week. Things started up on Tuesday night while I was at work. My front door camera went off and there wasn't anyone there. Not that big of a deal, maybe an animal or something. But 15 minutes later and it went off again, but this time my porch light is on. So I checked back through and it was off when I left, off in the next video and then just comes on again. I checked all of my other cameras inside and out, but there was no one at the house. For the rest of the night, the light goes on and off randomly as I keep checking. About 3 a.m. I turn on the camera and hear what sounds like someone talking, and the light is back on. I continue checking it, and 3:23 the light is off, and my coworker points out movement in the shadow in front of my door. I turn the camera lights on, but nothing there. This continued up until about 4:30, and then the light went off and stayed off. I got home at 7 and my TV was turned on, and that was definitely off when I left. But otherwise, everything was pretty normal. I worked the rest of the week and everything seemed normal as I checked in through the cameras. I had an electrician friend come over and check the porch light out on Friday. It's all good. So tonight, Saturday is my night off and I'm home watching TV. I live alone, so it's just me and the cat sitting in the living room watching TV when I start hearing someone talking. It seems to be coming from my bedroom, which is at the front of the house. Knowing that there's no one here but me, I figure it's outside, so I check the cameras. I don't see anyone around, but it gets quiet, so I figure they must have just went on down the street or something. I settle back in for my movie, and there it goes again. I decide at this point to just sort of ignore it, thinking that it's somebody else passing by. But suddenly, I hear my friend L calling me from my bedroom, but he's not here. He's definitely at work. I mean, I dropped him off myself at 6:45 and he won't be off until at least 7. I went into the bedroom and double-checked, but it's empty. Since then, too, I've heard it 3 more times. My cats have also reached and gone to look down the hallway, but won't go any further. At this point, I've closed the door and am planning on sleeping on the couch tonight because this whole thing is, well, really freaky. This happened in Hungary, summer of 2024. I was at my friend's place for the summer with his stepbrother. Us three are pretty good friends, and almost every night we went out into the woods or just walking past them. We have strange minds that we want to see something strange no matter what, and that's why we were there. Well, one night we actually did. We were going home already. It was pretty late, probably around 11 o'clock or so. We agree on checking one last place and going home after that. We went to the place and it was an abandoned horse ranch, not far from my friend's house. We saw a random humanoid-like creature on the end of the road. It was full white and glowing, but it didn't light the ground nor trees around it. We wanted to go close to see what it was. We started walking towards it when it suddenly looked like it turned around. It wasn't walking away, it just sort of stood in one place. At that, we panicked and we ran home. At home, we started shouting and yelling at each other because none of us knew what it was, and everybody said different things than the other. But we agreed on going back and finding out what it was to see who was right. The second time we went there, amazingly, we saw it again, because it was still there apparently. This time we went closer, when all of a sudden we heard a dog barking at us and we ran away. The dog was white like the creature and stood on an empty plain on our right side. And it's really strange too because we all had the same experience, but we all saw completely different things. Like, I saw the dog, it was big and white, no fence between us nor chain on the dog. My friend didn't see it but heard it bark, and the others saw different things too. The strange part is that, obviously, we run at different speeds. There was like almost 10 meters to 15 meters difference between us, but we all heard it directly behind us, like it was on our heels. And when at the end of the street, we stopped and looked back, the dog, or whatever it was, had disappeared. My guess is that that humanoid thing was a, hallucination sort of image that was projected upon us. But what do you think? What could this creature have actually been? This happened in February of 2016 when I was 23 years old. I was living in northern New Mexico at the time and had driven up to Boulder, CO to visit a friend for the weekend. I had taken this route several times before, so I was comfortable driving the long distance alone. The trip home was uneventful until I stopped for gas in Alamosa. This was the last real town before home, about 90 miles to go and not a whole lot in between except for a few tiny rural communities and desolate high desert landscape. It was around 6 p.m. and starting to get dark outside. Now, as I pulled out of the gas station, I noticed a dark blue sedan pull out behind me and turn into the same highway that I was. I didn't think anything of it until the car started tailgating me. I was confused because they could have easily passed me if I was driving too slow, since there were hardly any other cars on the road. When I sped up, though, they did too. When I slowed down, so did they. No matter what speed I drove, the car stayed right behind me. I assumed it was a cop waiting for me to make a mistake to pull me over, but it just never did. I was starting to get uncomfortable, so in the next little town of Antonito, I pulled over onto the side of the convenience store, thinking to myself that if this was a cop, they would surely get out and talk to me at this point. They pulled up right behind me, but nobody got out of the car. I parked and waited for several minutes before driving off, with the car still following close behind. 60 miles until home now. As soon as I crossed the state line into New Mexico, I knew that this was definitely not a cop. My heart sank as I drove deeper and deeper into the dark mesa. I didn't have a real phone at the time, just an old iPhone that couldn't connect to Wi-Fi, so there was no way for me to let anyone know what was happening. It also feels important to mention here that this is a particularly sketchy area. A lot of eerie and sometimes downright frightening stuff happens out here on the mesa. I was so distraught over why this person was still tailgating me that I drove right past the last turn onto the long dirt road that would take me home. I was so distraught over why this other person was tailgating me like this that I drove right past the last turn onto the long dirt road that would take me home. Thankfully, just down the highway there was a popular and well-lit, scenic rest area that I could turn around at. The sedan, of course, pulled in right behind me. But this time, feeling brave and a bit stupid, I guess, I decided to confront them. But behind the wheel was a totally normal-looking middle-aged woman. I'm not sure what I was expecting, but it certainly wasn't that. The back seat was too dark to tell if anybody was sitting back there, but I asked what the heck her problem was, and she apologized, saying that she thought that it was her daughter's car, which made no sense because my car had a completely different state's plate and was also covered in very unique bumper stickers. There was no way that it could have been confused for anyone else's car, really. And also, why wouldn't she have just called her daughter instead of following for like close to 90 miles? It made no sense, so I told her off and she apologized again. When I got back onto the highway and turned onto my dirt dead-end road, she turned in too. I immediately pulled over and yelled at her, "Lady, stop following me. There's no out to the highway from here. It's dark and confusing and a very dangerous place to get lost. You need to turn around now." She apologized, but when I got back into the car and started driving, she kept on following me. Thankfully, I was close enough to home and knew my boyfriend was there waiting for me. But she even pulled into the driveway with me, this time getting out of her car, asking if she could please stay the night. She was so tired and to please let her in. I was screaming at her to leave when my boyfriend came outside hearing the commotion. Literally, the moment that she saw him, she ran back to her car and she just peeled out of there. The whole ordeal was so strange and so freaky, and to this day I have no idea what she really wanted or why she chose to follow my car for such a huge distance. To begin this story, it's important to understand that my dad was never a good father. He lacked all the qualities a normal mentally healthy father would, and we lived in very low-income housing. When he was in high school, he was told that he was unable to have kids due to a car accident. Unfortunately, he still could in fact have kids, and in his 20s to 30s, he actually managed to accumulate 13 kids. 15 now. I was number 13. Even though I lived week on, week off custody with my father, it feels like I never really got to know him, nor was I ever introduced to more than one of my father's other kids that were before me. My older half-sister was the only other person that I'd ever met. I don't even know her mum. A lot of this memory has been repressed into deep corners of my mind, so details might seem a little foggy. I'm 21 now, and I only recently fully acknowledged that it happened. I even confirmed it with my mum. So when I was 10, someone entered our apartment. I cannot remember what his name was, but he claimed to be one of my father's long-lost children. He seemed to be in his late teens to early 20s, and he asked if he could stay with us for a while he attempted to get back on his feet after moving up from California. I'm in Oregon. He didn't seem to have many belongings except an old laptop and was rough around the edges. Mid-length hair, light shadow on the face, fairly skinny and tall. My dad was always weird about him, though. He told him that this was my brother, his family, and will be taking my room for a bit while I sleep in the living room. What was weird, though, was that my dad would never let me enter my old room. I remember thinking, even though my new brother is kind of odd, he was a super cool guy. I mean, we played Minecraft together on LAN. He was a programmer trying to make some Skyrim-like game, and he showed me everything that he had made so far. He stayed with us for around a month. The day that he was chased out of the apartment, we were having a Minecraft redstone competition to whoever could make the cooler redstone build. And the next day, we would present what we made and decide who had the better build. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, who knows, that never came to happen because that night, I'm not sure what time it was, but at least past midnight, I heard screaming. It was clearly my father, and loud banging coming from the wall over in our apartment. After probably 30 seconds of banging, on the couch I witnessed my father, full rage, chasing out whoever my brother was as he ran out of the apartment holding a knife. My dad screamed and yelled, and he chased him outside, but as he ran away, my dad came back to make sure that we were okay. Much later that night, I went to sleep with my dad sitting in the living room until dawn, guarding the apartment. It wasn't until months later that I did find out exactly what had happened that night. Mostly my father's words, and he liked to embellish things, so definitely take this with a grain of salt. Apparently, whoever was pretending to be my brother went into my father's room late at night and stabbed him in the chest while he was sleeping. My father woke up, and since he had previous military work in the Middle East, I guess sprung pretty quickly into action as my younger sister was about to get stabbed too. My father tackled the man and wrestled him for a bit, beating him senseless. After a struggle, he managed to get free and ran out of the apartment. That's about all I can really remember too. Recently, I asked my mum about it, and she basically confirmed the whole story and added in some bits that put it all together. My mum saw the stab wound herself and said that he never went to the hospital, but instead that she patched him up, and she's a nurse and he couldn't afford that anyway. It wasn't really that bad, she said, but I guess at some point after it happened, I also told her about it, which I don't really have any memory of, but the police at some point came by and took a look around. The impersonator was wanted in California, allegedly, Oregon and Washington for a multitude of crimes. I don't remember his name, so it's not like I could ever find out if he was caught or anything, but to wrap this up, and I don't know if this is really a good way to wrap it up anyway, but don't let random people in your house because, as I found out through my dad, that is really not a good idea. I was alone in a part of the schoolyard during the morning break. In the country I lived back in then, it was common for schools to have two breaks, a 30 to 45-minute break in the morning and an hour-long one at lunchtime. Now, there was a really tall tree, and I was sitting on one of the large roots that stuck out of the ground when I heard someone approaching. I turned to see who it was, and I saw that it was one of my friends. She said, "I bet you can't catch me." I told her that I could do it, and we started running around the tree while I tried to catch her and reach out for her. We were both laughing, and she was right. She was way too fast for me to reach her. Then one of my classmates called my name. I stopped running and turned around, and the boy who called my name asked, "What are you doing running around the tree by yourself like that?" I was about to tell him that I wasn't alone when I suddenly saw that my friend, who I thought was there with me just a few seconds ago, wasn't there anymore. It was really strange for me. So in the end, I just told the boy that it wasn't important and I just felt like doing it. Later that day, I saw my friend and she came and said, "How have you been?" And it was like she hadn't seen me that day. I didn't say anything about it or about what had happened earlier, but while we were talking, she mentioned that she had spent the break in her classroom talking with some of her friends, and it was true because I asked one of the friends later. This made me think that I was crazy or something, as it was impossible that she could be in two places at the same time like that. several years have passed since that day, and I really still cannot find an explanation for what actually happened, and I've really never told anyone about it too. I don't know if it was something supernatural, a glitch in the Matrix, or if I just imagined it, but what I do know is that I saw her. Also, I would appreciate if anyone could help me understand what this was and what actually happened, because it has had me perplexed for many, many years. So this happened just last night, and I'm really not sure if it's paranormal, but whatever the case may be, it's still pretty creepy. Perhaps even more so if it isn't paranormal. So my room is up against the front side of my house on the second story, and there's a window facing the front yard right next to my bed. I'm sitting there reading a book with my lamp on when I start hearing my name outside. At first it was so quiet that I didn't really hear it or pay attention to it. But then it got louder and louder, and I was really confused because it sounded like my old neighbor, who just moved out, but visited that same day, because it sounded like an 11-year-old boy's voice, although it sounded off from my old neighbor. I was confused though because he had visited my house that day and had already left to go back to his house in another town. Plus, it was really late at night for him to be trying to get me to go outside. I could tell from the tone of the voice, though, that whoever it was trying hard to get someone's attention. But right when I paid attention to the voice and thought all of this, the voice just suddenly stopped, and I realized that my shadow was being projected onto the window because of the lamp. I looked out the window, but I didn't see anyone there, but I did hear as if someone was opening and closing the downstairs window on that side. I went downstairs and checked with my sisters who were watching TV. I asked them if the TV was loud or if they heard someone calling my name, to which both of them said no, and the TV was actually really quiet. And then I went into my parents' room to ask them about it. Both of them had been asleep and they heard nothing. So in the end, I just went back to sleep at that point and nothing else happened. The thing is that this isn't the first time that I've heard voices at that window. You see, years ago when my house was severely haunted, I was opening the blinds in the morning and I heard a woman whisper right into my ear good night. I could even feel the breath on my ear, which was especially freaky. I smiled because I thought it was my mum at first messing with me and saying goodnight when it was morning. I turned around with a smile, and my smile immediately disappeared from my face because there was nobody else in the room. Everyone else was either across the hall or downstairs completely. Plus, I didn't hear anyone come or leave, and so that was definitely spooky. Anyway, if you have any ideas as to what this voice might have been, then please do let me know, because I'm hoping that it isn't a repeat of, well, whatever those voices were. So my roommate has 2 boys. One is around 2 and the other 4 to 5 years old. They share a room which happens to be right next to my boyfriend and I's room. Their door is often left cracked open, so my roommate can check on them throughout the night. The other night, my boyfriend went to go and use the bathroom, but was actually stopped short by the older kid talking to something in their room. He was facing the closet while in bed, saying something along the lines of, "No, I can't go, I'm in bed." His little brother was asleep and nobody else was in the room. My boyfriend went to turn on the light as he was a little bit freaked out by hearing this, only to be startled by my roommate's kid, now standing at the door saying, "I see you," then disappearing into the room. The next morning, I was sitting at the dining room table drinking coffee when my roommate's kid comes up to me and starts describing what he was talking to last night. He said that it was all black, had one eye and hands. When I asked if he was talking about what he was talking to last night and if he talks to it often, he then said yes. This morning, his grandmother, roommate's mum, told me that he often has nightmares where he wakes up screaming. I don't know if whatever or whoever he was talking to that night is attached to him or if it's something that's in our apartment. Whatever the case, it's pretty creepy, right? I've always had an odd feeling towards their room and never really felt comfortable going into it or even being near the door, really. There's been a few times my boyfriend and I have experienced odd things in this apartment as well, but this one, it definitely takes the cake for me. When I was 17, I worked construction for a small company outside of Kansas City. We did multiple jobs all over the city, from restaurants to stores. On this particular job, we got a contact to remodel a church. We went and gave bids and everything went well, and we ended up actually securing the job. The first day, the day that we arrived, nothing really was out of the ordinary. It was a typical Monday, and we unloaded all of the tools and took measurements and just sort of looked around and really admired the beauty of the place, I guess. We took all measurements and got lists of materials needed, and we just called it a day. The second day, we showed up and waited for our materials to be delivered, and while we waited, we got to tearing down some of the old rotten wood and broken flooring. Maybe when we were about, half an hour to an hour into this, we heard walking in the back room. We thought it was the delivery guy coming in the back door, but when we went out to check, nothing was there, and the door was locked. We didn't think much of it and just shrugged it off, and soon enough the materials arrived and we started finishing up removal and we called it a day. On the third day, we show up and our supplies are absolutely in disarray. We call the owner, and we ask if anyone has been there, and he informs us that the church is closed for the week for the construction. This kind of freaks us out a bit, but we just slap it all back together and we go back to work. But the entire day, when anyone would make a noise or remove something or add anything to the church, we would hear a bang behind the pulpit. We investigated it like 10 times, but there was nothing there, and it never would repeat or do anything unless we were actively working on the church. It starts to get dark, and we both leave a little early that day, and we didn't enjoy that day at all. On the fourth day, I'll be honest and say that I'm already not wanting to go, but of course we have to. We show up at like 2 or 3 p.m. and start going about it. And sure as heck, as soon as we begin, it's right back, and even louder this time. I didn't even want to work anymore. Well, we got so annoyed that we physically moved the podium to the back of the church in the end. The banging, it doesn't stop though. Doesn't stop coming from the same place, right under where it was. We just try to ignore it, and we keep working. But again, I refuse to stay after dark, and we do what we can and we leave. Now, on the last day, we show up and first thing I clearly see is the podium. It's back where it started, and our supplies were messed up even more than last time. I am at this point completely over the whole job, and I clean up our supplies and tell my buddy to move the podium again and let's just finish this. He moves it and we start working. This time though, there's absolutely no banging, which was wonderful. This goes on for half an hour to an hour, and then, all of a sudden, we hear loud running footsteps in the back. We both go and check. We were scared, and there is absolutely nothing there. Like, there's not even a thing in the room. This happens about maybe 5 or 6 times in the span of a few hours. Finally, though, we both agree that it's time to just leave. We start packing our tools, and that was when we hear the most terrifying scream from what I guess was a girl, and running in the back again, but inhumanly fast. And that was the last straw. We ran outside as fast as we could. We left the tools and had the owner leave them outside, and we picked them up later. I never went into that place again, and all I can say is that there is something horribly wrong with that church. I never got paid for that job either because we didn't finish it, but to be honest, I didn't care. So I once babysat my two cousins, brother and sister, along with my little brother, at their house one summer. I was downstairs on the computer in the main room when the brother and sister just started fighting. It all began because the brother was snooping on his sister's phone calls with their mum or something, my aunt, using the other house phone or whatever. He quickly ran upstairs, though, and locked himself in the master bedroom, using one of those old-fashioned metal locks to get away from her. As I ran upstairs to stop him from getting a beatdown, the sister SWAT team kicked the door open, breaking the latch, and just about got to him, until I split them up and I told her to go to her room next door and dragged him downstairs to sit with me and my brother while I went back on the computer. All of a sudden, though, I heard a similar kick to a door and thought, what the heck is she doing up there? The boys looked just as confused because it was such a loud noise and we thought maybe she was still tripping out. So right away I ran to the bottom of the stairs to tell her to calm down, but she already was there at the top of the stairs yelling, "Tell RJ to leave me alone, leave my door alone." And my heart instantly dropped when I told her no one came up there. She turned her back to the wall and slid to the floor, screaming in horror. I ran up there shaking and brought her down slowly, trying to process how the heck that sound was made when she was the only one upstairs. Finally, when we got down, I told the boys to get outside and we all sat on the front steps waiting for our grandmother to show up. She investigated the house and tried to say that it was just a truck passing by, but we all knew deep down that there was no way that it was a truck. A few years later, when they moved out, my cousin's dad finally fessed up that the previous owner, who was an old man, had actually fallen down those stairs, broke his neck, and laid there for a week before anybody found him. To this day, I think my cousin ticked him right off for breaking his bedroom lock, and did the same right back to her. So I used to work at my ex-father-in-law's law practice. I was in my early 20s and I worked there for years at this point. The office, it was one of those old historical 3-story buildings that is over like 100 years old. My co-workers and I, we witnessed all kinds of weird stuff there too. Sometimes we would see it together, sometimes separately, and sometimes we'd find evidence of strange stuff too. One time during everybody's lunch break, I decided to stay and work. The kitchen microwave door kept opening though. I would hear it, get up, close it, and sit back down. This happened 3 different times within the hour as well. Another time, my ex-sister-in-law and her 2 kids were visiting. They were just hanging out in the waiting area, and I was in the room talking to them. But suddenly, the kitchen light in the next room came on, and at the same time, 2 wall photos in the waiting room fell to the ground. That was pretty insane. Also, there was this sort of heavy old-school timestamp machine that was in the kitchen, and we would find it on the ground all the time. The thing, though, was on the counter, sitting against the wall, and it was super heavy. We eventually moved it to one of my co-workers' office, and it would fall on the floor in there too. Sometimes we would hear it happen even, and there it would be on the floor with no explanation for how the heck it even got there. We have also heard upstairs footsteps, doors opening and closing regularly when nobody was upstairs. My ex-husband worked there too, and he said that he never experienced anything like that and thought that it was all in our heads. But he became a believer one evening when he stayed at work after hours. He was alone in his office, and a huge framed painting that sat above the old fireplace, the mantel, just crashed onto the floor, made a huge mess too. It honestly never felt malicious, I guess. We just sort of always laughed it off and said the ghost was up to its regular hijinks, and I don't even know what it was, to be honest. I never believed in ghosts, but I will tell you that there is definitely something in that office that I cannot explain. It was a typical Tuesday night, the kind where the darkness outside crept into the corners of the room, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. I was nestled on the couch, binge-watching my favorite TV series, oblivious to the horrors lurking just beyond my front door. The sound came faintly at first, a subtle creaking that I brushed off as the house settling, but then it grew louder, more pronounced, like the slow, deliberate steps of someone trying to be stealthy, perhaps. My heart quickened its pace as a chill raced down my spine, the air thickening with an undeniable sense of sudden dread. I glanced around, searching for reassurance in the familiar surroundings of my living room, but the silence that followed was honestly deafening, punctuated only by the pounding of my heartbeat in my ears. I convinced myself that it was just my imagination running wild, that there was nothing to fear. But then I heard it, the unmistakable click of the front door being unlocked. Panic surged through me as I leapt to my feet, my mind racing with adrenaline-fueled thoughts. Without hesitation, I crept toward the doorway, my senses on high alert as I strained to hear any sign of movement on the other side. And then I saw him, a shadowy figure looming in the doorway, his features obscured by the darkness. Fear gripped me like a vice as I stumbled backward, my voice caught in my throat. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out, my words trembling with fear. But he said nothing, his silence more chilling than any words could ever be, really. Instead, he advanced towards me, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. I backed away, my mind racing with desperate pleas for escape, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from the terror that had invaded my home. With each step he took, the room seemed to shrink around me, closing in until there was nowhere left to go. And then, in an instant, he was upon me, a dark, menacing presence that enveloped me in its suffocating embrace. I fought back with all the strength that I could muster, but it was no use. His grip was ironclad, his intentions clear as he bore down on me with a ferocity that sent shivers down my spine as I fought. I screamed for help, but my cries fell on deaf ears as the darkness just seemed to swallow me. And then, just as suddenly as it had all began, it was over. The intruder got up, ran, and vanished into the night, leaving me battered and bruised in his wake. As I lay there, trembling and broken, I knew that I would never be the same after that. The horror of that night haunts me and will forever, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks just beyond the safety of our own front doors. And although the intruder may have escaped into the night, the scars that he left behind, well, they'll never fade away. This happened a while ago, back in late July, early August of 2022, at around maybe 9 o'clock at night. I think maybe even. Me and my friend, we decided to take photos in the forest that evening. Yeah, I know, it's a bit of a dumb idea, but everything was going fine. Of course, slightly scary due to the dark, but all was well. We were two girls in the forest, and it's twilight, which is risky, I know, but at around 9:40, my friend's mum calls her saying that we should go back to her place because it's getting late. This was understandable, so we ended up heading back to her place. I asked her, can we take the shortcut out of the forest, and She says alright to this, and that was our biggest mistake. While going through the shortcut, I see some guy in front of us. I then notice that he's holding an axe in one hand and was wearing a horse mask. He was quite tall, being well over 6 foot, and he was slowly coming towards us. I suddenly take my friend's hand, because, well, I'm thinking that we're about to die, and tell her, do not go there, there's a dude wearing a horse mask up there. But she ignores me, continues walking towards him slowly. With no emotion, I just take her hand and just force her to run to the longer exit from the forest. While running, I'm literally not hearing anything she's saying to me because I'm in a complete panic. While running, I see a random woman walking with 2 average-sized dogs. Yes, I know I'm dumb for not warning her about the horse dude, but I was in a panic, like I said. And finally, we escape the forest and are about to go to her place. While walking to her place, she's asking me a bunch of questions like, what was that stuff back there? And she also mentions hearing that the guy was running after us. So yeah, we were petrified and we go to her place and we just talk about what happened. And to be honest, I genuinely wish that that was the end of it, but it wasn't. You see, in October of 2022, I was casually browsing Latvian news and see some articles about a dead person in the same forest that me and my friend were in. So my question is, did we escape a murder via an axe dude wearing a horse mask? I don't know if I should report this or what, but I just need some guidance. I'll try to keep it brief. So, Saturday night, my boyfriend and I were heading home after a drinkless night out. I was driving and pulled up to a red light and told him keep an eye out for the green light for me, because I wanted to check my phone. Now, I always pull up on the white line. I hate when people stop short of it. I was fully aware and not sleepy at all when I said this, and for some additional context, I was going down a slight hill as well. I was up the hill from the light, so I would have had to have rolled backwards up the hill with my car in drive. I also have the auto parking brakes on when my car comes to a complete stop. But the next thing I know, I just woke up, car about 40 feet away from the line by the red light. Confused and a little bit panicked, I muttered something like, "What the heck?" And my boyfriend sat up and said, "What just happened?" I snapped at him. I said, "Let me know when the lights turn green. I don't know." And he said, "Wait, how long were we sitting here for?" I shrugged. He then says, "My video's been playing for 10 minutes. And went back through the video that he had just started and didn't remember any of the video in the time that had passed. It absolutely creeped me out, though. In fact, I barely slept all of Saturday night, and Sunday I joked about it with my sister. But today, on the way to work, my boyfriend and I passed the same traffic light, so I asked him, "What do you think happened Saturday? Weird, huh?" And he had no idea what I was talking about. I recounted the entire story as specific as I could, but he didn't even remember getting home or the ride home at all. So my question for all of you guys is, what the heck actually happened? Something supernatural? Was it an abduction case? And if so, do I report it? And to where? So, it was about 11:30 p.m. Kids are asleep, wife is sleeping next to me, dog is laying on the bed, and I was just gaming. Everything is quiet, lights are all off in the house for the night, and I'm chilling, playing some Halo, I think, when all of a sudden I start hearing some heavy footsteps walking up the staircase, coming upstairs. Our stairs are very creaky, so when you get to the top of the stairs, the last 4 stairs will creak, and they make a loud popping noise that you can hear pretty well. Normal stair sounds, right? Well, it wasn't normal to hear that. At 11:30 at night,